Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. As always, thank you so much for listening. And as always, thank you so much, those of you who have decided to support the efforts of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We so appreciate it. It's put to good use. Well, we think it is. This week, it's a happy 4th of July, Independence Day to everyone. And Clay, we are so fortunate. The contributors that have added to the Thomas Jefferson Hour over the years, I really thought this 4th of July, it would be great to hear from some of them, and they all agreed, and I think we put together a pretty interesting show for this week.
Well, we turned to several of our favorites. The famous Crisler, he's like Cher, he just has one name. And then Joe Ellis, our undisclosed champion from Vermont, and Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, our young Turk, who is shaking up the complacent world of Thomas Jefferson and the Thomas Jefferson Hour. But let me say this about funds. You know, we don't spend a single penny on bottle rockets, and I wanted to ask you a question. David Swenson, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, when's the last time you actually lit a firecracker or a Roman candle or a bottle rocket?
Oh, it's been a while.
Years?
You know, when you have children, young boys at home, well, that's different. But becoming an adult, not so much anymore.
It's been 15 years, I think, since I lit off anything. But as a child, of course, I lived for the 4th of July. We would often go out into the country, and we had our private fireworks. Now it's much more common to have community fireworks, and I often go down to the state capitol building in Bismarck, where my friend Beverly Everett is the orchestral director for Sousa-like music and other patriotic and festive music. And they set up here in North Dakota a pretty impressive set of fireworks. But it's not quite the same as when you have that punk and you put it up, next to the $13 cone that you scrape to purchase and watch it go off. But I was so pleased to hear from Brad.
It's been a long time since we've talked to him, and it's good to hear his voice. He's always got...
He's a poet.
Yeah.
There's a warmth and deep thinking in Crisler, and it's easy to take Crisler for granted because he's a Nashville star, and he's a singer-songwriter, and he has that great accent. But then when you listen to him actually talk about what's at stake in America, you realize he spends a lot more time thinking about this than most of us do, and he never says an uninteresting thing here on the Thomas Jefferson Hour. And then we turn to these heavyweights.
Yeah, Lindsay always has tidbits of historical information that I so enjoy.
Me too. And of course, Joe is Joe. And when he's on the program, I just like to sit back and listen to Joe Ellis, because we're talking about one of the top 5 historians of the early national period, without question. The award-winning, the prize-winning Dr. Joseph Ellis, and the fact that he spends his time with us is just so purely satisfying and delightful to me.
When Joe turns to Adams, of course, that's a whole nother thing. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Anyway,
so where will you be on the 4th of July, my friend?
I have a tendency to kind of stay home and work in the garden and avoid the large crowds. Although, as you mentioned, Beverly Everett and what happens on the Capitol grounds, that's always fun.
So do you have a special meal that you eat on the 4th of July?
Yeah, but nothing that I always come back to. But, of course, eating is a big part of the 4th.
I've been to these places out at the lake. There is one lake in North Dakota where it's like giant chests of beer and bratwurst and hamburgers and cheeseburgers and hot dogs in every direction, and 6 types of potato salad, German potato salad and American potato salad, and you name it. And there's just this vast feast and way too much available beer. And the sun on the 4th of July here in North Dakota is usually about 100 degrees. You lie out on the sand and you get a little sunburned. And you gather, and there's like fresh watermelon after the supper, and then dusk comes late here on the northern Great Plains, 9:30, 10:30, and the children are all begging to light the firecrackers and the fireworks before they have to go to bed, and the adults want to wait until it's completely dark, and there are jet skis still out on the water, and the moon rises in the east, and you just think, yeah, America. That's a uniquely American moment. There's no analog in Canada. There's no analog in Britain. There's no analog even in revolutionary France. This is an American thing. And if you don't have a bratwurst or a hot dog or a cheeseburger on the 4th of July, if you're having, Thai salad or Korean barbecue, you're not really doing justice to the deep structure of American joy.
I have a tendency to kind of get serious and I don't want to say emotional, but something clicks in me. And, I think about these are men and women, individuals from a couple centuries ago that risked everything for something most Americans, myself included, take for granted now. And I guess to me, the 4th of July is to try to combat that. I don't want to take it for granted. I want to take the day to remember why it is we even celebrate.
Well, and not to get too political, but while this is going on this year, the January 6th committee hearings, televised committee hearings, are occurring, and we are witnessing one of the moments when you really had to wonder if our brand of small r republicanism was going to survive. When I think of this, the other day I was in Philadelphia, David, it's just so joyous. I was able to give an endowed lecture at the Library Company of America, which was the world's first subscription library, created, of course, by our friend Benjamin Franklin. And I spent 2.5 days going to different intellectual institutions in Philadelphia. And on one occasion, I got to see the second draft of the Declaration of Independence in Jefferson's beautiful handwriting, faded by time, some of it held together with rice paper. And there it was, and just two things about it. First, he had X'd out or put a bracket around the famous passage on slavery, which was expunged at the insistence of the Carolinas and Georgia. But as I looked at it, I just thought, wow, Jefferson. We take that for granted too, but he sat there with a quill pen on Market Street in Philadelphia. He said he consulted neither book nor pamphlet, and he wrote these words. He could have written anything. This was a birth certificate for the United States, and it was a declaration of legal independence from Britain. He could have just said that, and many people would have. But instead he said, in this magisterial clarity, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When you hear those words or read those words or see them on the page, especially in Jefferson's handwriting, you just have to think, whatever's wrong with Jefferson, and there is plenty that one can point to, there's almost nobody in the world who could have done this in the way that he did this. And because of that, that document is one of the world's handful of most important utterances, leaving the Bible out and the Quran for the moment. It ranks with the Magna Carta. It ranks with the British Bill of Rights of 1688. It ranks with the Emancipation Proclamation. I mean, if you added up the Gettysburg Address, if you add up the most important pronouncements in the history of human liberty, top 5 under any list was written by this 33-year-old fellow from Virginia who had this gift for expression and a deep understanding of what's at stake. And I can't think of that without just revering Jefferson and believing that if we had to eliminate every Jefferson statue and pluck down the Jefferson Memorial in Washington and erase him from Mount Rushmore, he would still be necessary, at least as the author of this thing, because this is the standard against which every system of government anywhere on earth is tested. Nobody else could have done that. Not John Adams, not George Washington, not James Madison. This was Jefferson, and what Adams said of him is exactly right, David. He had, quote, a peculiar felicity for expression. Jefferson. We'll see you all soon. Listen now to this special 4th of July edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Thanks, everyone. We love you.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, our annual 4th of July show, and we're so pleased to welcome 3 of our favorite Thomas Jefferson Hour contributors. And we'll begin with Mr. Brad Crisler.
Crisler, I call you, because you're like Madonna and Cher or Prince, the man with only one name, living in Nashville, Tennessee. And Crisler, as our Jefferson Hour listeners knows, is one of the few people who ever called our bluff and came to visit and insisted on seeing the barn. And with appropriate protocols and protections, we did make that happen. Welcome, Brad.
Hi, it's good to be with you guys. Yes, moniker Crisler. Although I'm a bit put out now because you have a new nemesis in Lindsay. I feel like I'm not the brunt of your ire as I used to be, and it's a little hurtful to me.
No, you'll always be Crisler. You know, I have to treat her with respect and dignity.
Ha!
And I don't need to do that with you. So, but you're the Newman of this thing, if you remember Newman on Seinfeld. But you know what I was just saying, before we called you today, that we count on you. Because you're so many different things. You're a singer-songwriter, you are a painter, you're a collector of historic miniature paintings, and maybe more important for us than all of that is that you really do reflect a lot about where things are. And I remember getting an email from you a year or two ago in which it was clear that you were filled with, I'd say, despair and anxiety about the future of the American Republic. And so we count on you to center our conversations. And I'm really interested in finding out what you're thinking about as the 4th of July approaches here in 2022.
Well, as always, I try to put on a blanket of gratefulness because personally, I'm very blessed and are lucky, or however you would like to frame the cosmos. But I'm just eternally grateful for my family, for my career, for the place I am in life, for my home, and for, provisions and all those things. And so I try to keep how I look at our current, predicament and the state of the world through the lens of personal gratefulness. But I do continue to be, not misanthropic, but just concerned about kind of the direction we're heading. And I believe 2024 may be the ball game and respect, or at least the tail of the tape, because I think I was just listening to the previous week's podcast with you all and Joe Ellis, and I was thinking, the guardrails that held won't hold again. I don't believe. I think we either have to decide to have new guardrails, or we have to kind of put a bow on it and say, well, that was the experiment, because I feel pretty dark about how things are lining up for the next election and all of that. But, history is our oracle. And, I tell my daughters all the time when they ask questions about, where we are and has it ever been like this? And, I just have to return to history and say, the sky has been falling, as David likes to say. Both of you guys lived through the late 60s, and the sky was definitely falling then. I know this is a different time, but I have to look at history and think, well, there is hope of the other side.
Well, just a couple of quick things, and we want to ask you what you're going to be doing on this 4th of July specifically, but. David and I lived through the late 60s, and they were a tumultuous time, but we thought we were giving birth to the age of Aquarius. In other words, there was a deep hopefulness that a new wave, a new era of peace and prosperity and self-government and a changing of the guard was going to happen. It didn't quite work out that way, but this one's different. This is a pivotal moment, but I don't see a lot of signs of hope. So my question for you is this. The January 6th hearings are really amazing. They're not over yet, of course, at the time that we're recording this. Do you think that they will, A, make a difference and remind Americans of what's at stake, B, simply be a wash, and when they're over, it won't have moved the needle, as we now like to say, an iota, or C, just further disillusion the American people? Where are you on what this is likely to be? Because we remember the Watergate hearings, and they had a huge ameliorative effect on our politics.
Yeah, and very different. I'm not sure who the John Dean of the January 6th committee could be. I guess it could be Mike Pence if he decided to participate. But I'm probably in the B category in that I think, as with most things concerning our current politics, the sorting has already happened. People, as you know, Fox isn't really covering the hearings to any degree, and so the people whose minds would be changed, or maybe there would be some enlightenment in terms of new information. I believe those people who might learn some things that would be helpful are probably have dismissed them as partisan, a witch hunt, as they have been called. So I don't think it will make much difference, and it will just further exasperate and terrify those of us who understand the depth of what happened on January 6th. So I don't, again, I don't want to cast a shadow over our time together, but I do believe that it's, I'm a realist and an observationalist, and I'm not a Eeyore. I can't be that, but I do try to contextualize the information that I process. And I have to be honest, I live in a part of the country where, and I know as you do too, but you get, if you go into the community and have coffee and just have conversations, or mostly just listen, ask questions and listen, you get a pretty stark read on where partisan ideas are and thought, and I don't have a lot of hope that we're moving in a direction that is too hopeful. So.
Goodness, this is getting pretty dark for an Independence Day. If I may interject, I think it's pretty simple. People on both sides of these questions have the same desire and fear. That is that America is going to be ruined by the other position. Maybe it's as simple as we need to redefine what America is. And I would hope that is not a direction of authoritarianism, although some people want that. So I kind of wish we had a leading national figure that was Reagan-esque or something that could bring us to that conversation.
I just disagree with you slightly on that one, David. And again, it's a 4th of July program, so we don't want to go down this rabbit hole too long. But, if we're playing Monopoly, if the three of us are playing Monopoly, and David Swenson is winning and Crisler is losing, as one might expect, if Crisler throws the board up or tosses it over his head or says, I'm going to light fire to your tokens, or I'm going to punch you in the mouth every time you buy Park Place, that's not America. America is playing by a set of codes and rules. And when you lose an election, as say Al Gore did under somewhat suspicious circumstances in 2000, you nevertheless concede, give a gracious speech, help the other side take over, and become the loyal opposition. So we have to agree to play by some rules of engagement here. And when they break down, all bets are off, I think.
Well, isn't that what this is about, is changing the rules? January 6th and everything it's about changing the rules.
It's about using force to change the rules rather than process.
I think, in a larger philosophical context, I was again thinking about what you and Joe, what you all were talking about. The argument and the basis of so many books that the Academy is involved in American history is the meaning. What is the meaning of the American Revolution? And I think we're still trying to figure that out. Those arguments that you all make so clearly, when you talk about the 1790s and the formation of political parties and the idea about what does it mean to be a republic. I think all of these questions, and even in the midst of great ignorance, you can still see that we're trying to answer those questions. We may not realize that's what we're doing, but it feels like that's the nature of the experiment, is asking questions. What do we want? And how do we want to achieve what it is we want? And for all of its frustrations and terror at the current moment, I still believe that's what we're doing. And so the jury is still out. And as it has been out for many, many decades, I don't know if that helps framing, but I do think it's what's going on.
Hey, Brad, I hope you have a great 4th. It's really good to talk to you. We need to get you back on the program more often.
Yeah, I miss you guys. I listen and of course enjoy every week all the conversations with Lindsay and Joe and between you guys. And
before we say goodbye for this segment, do you have any message for the Thomas Jefferson Hour listeners, Brad?
I just hope that the Jefferson Hour continues to grow, and for all of you listen, please continue to support and not just listen, but take to heart and spread the example of civility and deep, informed conversation and kindness. Above all, kindness.
Thanks, Brad. Happy 4th.
We feel like truly that we're old friends and companions, and we so look forward to our conversations with you. So bless all of you on the 4th of July, and send a photo from whatever crazy thing you wind up doing down there.
We will. That's great. Thank you. Bye-bye.
And we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, our annual 4th of July show. I know Clay and I, we both look forward to this every year, talking about the 4th and what it meant to Jefferson and some of the things that happened. And we're so fortunate to have Lindsay Chervinsky join us, and not for a 10 Things episode, but for some reflections on the 4th of July. And thank you so much, Lindsay.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm excited to be on one of these July 4th episodes.
And when you think of the 4th of July, what do you think of? Either personally or historically?
Well, I think of a couple of things historically. I, of course, think about the first 4th of July and the celebrations, the Declaration of Independence, Washington's instructions for the Declaration to be read to the troops, what that must have meant.
Share that story with us about Washington.
Sure. Well, so after the Declaration of Independence was signed, they had a number of copies printed and sent to various people. So people across the different states, as well as to the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. And Washington was in the middle of his worst summer of the war, in the middle of a series of very embarrassing defeats across New York. And as a way to boost morale, decided to read the Declaration of Independence to the troops who he had ordered to gather. And as the myth was handed down, the troops were so inspired by this declaration, they then marched up the island of Manhattan and tore down the statue of King George III and melted it for bullets. Whether or not that's exactly how it happened, I think it's a really good metaphor for the moment and sort of the inspiration of why they were fighting. I think about the foreign implications of the Declaration of Independence. A lot of Americans don't learn that key aspect, that the Declaration was really designed to justify this revolution to monarchs across the world and to reassure them that they were not trying to topple all of these governments. I then think of the other July 4ths that I sometimes think of that are important. The Constitutional Convention, what that must have been like to be there on July 4th and trying to desperately come up with a second chance of the federal government. It's impossible to not think of the July 4ths when John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died. And then I think of things like the Civil War. What did the July 4th mean at moments of crisis like that? How did that appear to people? So that's sort of the historic context I think of. Personally, and I've talked about this in some of our other episodes, I love the United States so much that I feel compelled to criticize it. I'm sort of bastardizing that famous quote. I love America more than any other country in the world, and for exactly this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually. So I believe that we are an imperfect union. We should be constantly striving to be a more perfect union. And so therefore, July 4th is always a little bit bittersweet for me because I think of the things that we have done better. I think of the things we have improved. And I can't help but think of the things that I would like us still yet to improve.
So let me ask you a personal question, if you don't mind. How do you plan to spend this 4th of July?
Typically, I make some sort of a cake that is American flag themed. I love to bake on the side, and so I make some sort of dessert that is appropriate. And then I usually read history, which I do all the time, but I think it's an important thing to do, especially on the July 4th, to think about sort of where we are and where we want to go.
So you have a cake, you're on a deck chair, reading history, maybe you see in the distance some fireworks.
Perfect.
That's a great day. What's the perfect meal for you?
Well, I really like the tried and true, like American barbecue. I really like a good grilled chicken. I really like corn. I really like watermelon. Ideally, there would be, as I mentioned, some sort of sweet and then adult beverage, ideally iced because it will be hot. So I really like to go sort of all in. Or, depending on the year, I will confess on years that I felt particularly dark about things, I've gone ironic and I've done like Indian food or Mexican food just to be difficult.
Wow. Food snark. David, what do you do for the 4th this year?
Well, I tend to get up early in the morning and I turn on my computer and I find the Thomas Jefferson archives and I listen to them all day.
No, you don't.
I had you just for that much, right?
Until you said all day, I almost believed that one.
You had pointed out to me recently how long my tenure has been as the semi-permanent guest host and how much I've learned about Jefferson. And, I have to say it's in all seriousness, it's had a real effect on me. Learning as much as I have from being on the show and listening to, all the great guests and yourself, Clay, learning of the history of the American Revolution, which, most of us from our era grew up, and it's almost like a cartoon, a caricature of, Washington crossing the Delaware and all these great things. When you get down to the nuts and bolts of it, and maybe read Rick Atkinson's History of the American Revolution, it's not that at all. It's individuals who have made decisions of self-sacrifice in order that we can live like a bunch of spoiled, civilized folks in our own era. So I kind of go there on the 4th and try to remember how much we owe to the founding generation. I hope that's not too preachy, but it's a true thing for me.
No, it's from the heart. So I just want to say quickly, I'm with Lindsay. I think of the more perfect union. I'm not a big fan of the Declaration of Independence. I know that sounds like heresy, but I'm a fan of the vision of this country, a republic, a self-governing people, a people constantly striving to be rational, to be just, to be enlightened, to be tolerant, to be inclusive, to create something unprecedented in the history of the world. And we all know how difficult that would be under the best of circumstances, but I feel that we have slipped dramatically into radical materialism and narcissism and indifference and a kind of almost a hostility to the very idea of a civic religion. And so when I think of the 4th of July, I just want America to be my dream of America. And I think my dream of America has been touched by Thomas Jefferson, but not solely by Jefferson, but also by Washington and John Adams and Abigail Adams and Thomas Paine and even Aaron Burr. So I want more from my country, and I always have this slightly melancholy feeling that aren't we supposed to be like the world's class act? And how did we ever let it slip away? And can we reinvigorate this thing? That's me, and I think we all three share that, or we wouldn't be doing this sort of program. But I'm not fond of the beach and the beer and the brat, because I feel that that is an escape from the conversation we need to be having. And that conversation doesn't need to be ponderous or tedious or academic. But every American, I think, on the 4th of July should do a kind of a how we doing conversation with the persons around them. And I'd like to see a lot more of that, I think.
Well, going back to, what you said, David, about the founding generation, I always think that the very best way, they were brilliant men that did the best that they could under the circumstances, but they were deeply aware of their own flaws and limitations and what they hadn't yet been able to achieve. And the best way we can honor their sacrifice and their memory is to try and continue to improve upon what they did, because that was what they expected of us. And by not doing that, we are letting them down.
You told the story of Washington reading in the statue. I've got two preeminent historians in front of me. What other stories can you share about the 4th?
This story has been told time and time again, and I don't in any way want to make it a myth, but I think the most perilous moment for our nation was the Civil War. And on July 4th, the Union won a pivotal victory at Gettysburg, and the Union won a pivotal victory at Vicksburg. And they were the pillar victories in the West and the East that eventually led, of course, there were things that happened in between, but eventually led to the Union victory. And while in no way those victories were planned for that day, the power and the significance of that moment is extraordinary and should almost be viewed as almost like a vow renewal for the Union and what it could be and what it should be. And I think we're probably due for another renewal here, but that is a really important moment in our national story.
What's at stake here and how big the stakes are. So I have a more lighthearted one for you, David. The 4th of July, 1805, at the Great Falls of the Missouri River in what's now Montana. The Lewis and Clark expedition has discovered the falls, and Lewis wants to move on to the source of what he calls the mighty and heretofore deemed endless Missouri River. And they're beginning their portage around the falls, and the captains have reserved just a little bit more of the whiskey supply, and they hand out the last of the whiskey on the 4th of July, and Clark says they had a beautiful meal of a saddle of venison, his favorite frontier meal, and the men had their grog, and then he said they got a little merry because they had been without alcohol and they were working so hard, and they danced and they sang and they celebrated the birthday of America until a thunderstorm came in around 10 p.m., and then they settled down for the night. And when I think about that, I just take great joy in that A, they knew what day they were at, B, they can't be there doing this without thinking about their patron Thomas Jefferson back and wondering what he's doing on the 4th of July, 1805. They know some of it, that he's having his twice annual reception with much more interesting food than they're having on the Lewis and Clark Trail, but I'll bet it wasn't as satisfying. And then this idea of knowing what their destiny, their mission is in part deepened by the fact that they're aware that this is the 4th of July. And I would love to have been part of that one and hear Pierre Cruzat and George Gibson on their fiddles and the men pairing off and dancing Virginia reels and singing and chanting and boasts and toasts and dissing each other and all the things that happen when there is a very extraordinary moment. Sacagawea was not well right then, so she probably wasn't looking on with perplexity or joy, but she was there, and so was her infant child, Jean Baptiste.
Lindsay, we're undoubtedly going to be talking to Joe Ellis about the 4th of July. he being the Adamsite that he is, always brings up the 2nd of July as opposed to the 4th of July. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, he's right. I mean, John Adams was right. That was the big day. It just, John Adams often didn't have his say in how history was remembered. So in some ways, it's actually the perfect John Adams story because he was totally correct. It's just that history had its own way of remembering things. So poor John Adams.
Not only correct, but contrarian. What could be better?
I love it. I have such fondness for John Adams, and I find that he is an endless source of entertainment for stories exactly like that one.
Agreed.
Okay, I'm gonna read something to both you and Lindsay, which I just love. Hang on just a second here.
And thanks, Lindsay. This is
my pleasure.
Real sporting of you. I appreciate it.
Oh, no, happy to do it. Quincy even came in and joined for a second.
Yeah, it was great. That's the first time I've seen him.
Oh, well, I'll have to have him come back and actually introduce himself.
Yeah. Saw a great tail wag there.
A white tail.
Yes.
A white tipped tail.
Yeah.
So just we all know that John Adams on the 2nd of July said what he said about parades and fireworks and dancing and orations and so on. But here's something he said later in his life that's one of my very favorite John Adams quotations, because he had this sense that he was a martyr, that nobody really understood him, that he could never make himself understood, that he was born to be the subject of persecution and criticism and distrust. So here's what he said. I have compared myself to an animal I have seen take hold of the end of a cord with his teeth and be drawn slowly up by pulleys through a storm of squibs, firecrackers, and rockets, flaming and blazing round him every moment. And though the scorching flames made him groan and moan and roar, he would not let go of that rope till his hold till he had reached the ceiling of a lofty theater, where he hung some time, and at last descended through another storm of burning gunpowder. That's John Adams. That is such a great
Wow.
That's a beautiful, beautiful comic, exquisitely comic simile for the life of John Adams. And you have to love him, because imagine Jefferson saying a thing like this. You cannot imagine Washington saying a thing like this. You cannot imagine Madison or Monroe saying a thing like this. You can't imagine Abigail Adams saying this. One person and one person only could write that paragraph. John Adams.
He was exquisitely self-aware of his strengths, of his limitations, of his sometimes outright ridiculous behavior. I don't know if I've shared this, but at one point he complains to Abigail. She's back home. This is before his inauguration, or it was just after his inauguration, and he's begging for her to come and help him set up house because he cannot do it without her. He says he's hopeless without her. She makes all of these decisions. He desperately needs her. She has like 3 family members dying on her, and she's trying to take care of their estate. And he was like, why won't you pay attention to me? And he was like, my concerns are important. I think that you should pay attention to them. And then he writes, don't laugh, because he knows that he's being so petulant at this particular moment. And then he also says, like, please don't show this to anybody, because he knows that it's embarrassing behavior, and yet he's able to sort of be so fully himself with her. And so that, he had obviously made poor choices and had his flaws, of which I am currently sort of eyeball deep in at the moment as I'm heading into my summer of the Alien and Sedition Acts chapters. But he was so self-aware, and he was so acutely knowledgeable about how he operated, and really could write a brilliant turn of phrase about those things to make fun of himself.
But here's the thing, Lindsay. We now privilege Adams for that earthy candor, that wearing his heart on his sleeve, that incapacity to contain anything that is burbling through him. In the 18th century, it was Jefferson, the creature out of a Jane Austen novel, with decorum and grace and detachment and manners, that was the great desideratum. And so Jefferson now suffers because he seems stiff and emotionally detached, when he was an exquisite example of a certain high social style of the 18th century, and Adams was widely regarded by these same gentlemen as a volcanic mistake. And so the style of how we apprehend history has really changed, and it has made a huge gain for John Adams.
Well, I think that that's true, certainly publicly. And we talked about this when we did our 10 Things About Benjamin Rush episode, but that I think that his openness and candor actually made people love him when they were able to be his friends. It just wasn't necessarily
all three of them.
That's not particularly nice.
This is just great that we're talking about the 4th of
little
July.
Snark there.
We're talking about the 4th of July, and it's ended up being about John Adams. That's just perfect.
We love John Adams.
As it should be. Oh my God, this is like
as
the
it should
most.
Be.
Don't you think that Thomas Jefferson is just like rolling over in his grave right now? I just think that this is so delightful.
It's an image I don't want to go to. Before we say goodbye to you, Lindsay, do you have any holiday wishes for the American public, the Thomas Jefferson Hour listeners?
I hope everyone has a safe and pleasant 4th of July. I encourage everyone to think about our very messy and complex origins, and by all means have fun with your family and friends and celebrate, but take a moment to think about the complex place where we came from, and we are in another complex moment, and I just don't think that we should shy away from that complexity.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks so much for all you do for the Jefferson Hour. You have just brightened our doorstep so much.
Absolutely. You and yours have a great holiday, Lindsay. We'll see you after the 4th.
And we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, our annual 4th of July show that I know Clay and I both look forward to this, and it being one of Jefferson's favorite holidays, even the more so. But we are now joined by the historian Joseph Ellis, one of our regular contributors to the Jefferson Hour. And Joe, I'm so glad you agreed to join us and talk about the 4th.
Well, it is a big anniversary, and I'm known to say that in some ways the date's wrong. Shouldn't be the 4th. It should be the 2nd.
Here we go.
Well, I'm not going to, hear me out. Adams
someone needs to speak for poor Mr. Adams. Go right ahead.
Yeah, well, no, it's not just Adams. It's for historical accuracy here. Nothing happened on the 4th. They didn't sign the document on the 4th. There was never a single day when they all signed. Most of them signed on the 2nd of August. But the only thing that happened on the 4th is they sent it to the printer, and the printer put July 4th on the top of the document. On July 2nd, they actually voted for independence. And Adams always went to his grave thinking that was the day they would, and even wrote a letter to Abigail the day after saying, yesterday will be the day that we celebrate with all kinds of spectacular fireworks. He got everything right except the day. I do think, though, that the 4th becomes the day at some point in the early 19th century. Up until the early 19th century, they didn't celebrate the 4th. They celebrated Washington's birthday as the annual anniversary. And this has replaced it. And I'm prepared to accept it. I think even in his grave, before he went into his grave, Adams accepted it. Okay. And if you wanted to know that they eventually accepted it, guess what? The most important piece of evidence. They both died on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary. The date was always wrong. They made it right by essentially dying on that day.
David, I hope you'll play the song to the tune of Sour Grapes behind that little monologue there.
Now, you two.
Adams should have died on the 2nd of July just to mess with Jefferson.
Well, it's interesting. Like a lot of founders seem to time their death. I mean, Monroe died on July 4th. Madison tried to make it, and he just missed. He died on June 28th. But they're trying to go out on the date, and so that it's the date. It is the date, and And I think that both Adams and Jefferson together, I'm not just being an Adams guy, I mean, I recognize that it becomes that for us. And the celebrations that we have now are appropriate in that regard. And given the nature of the Republic, given the divisions, given the lack of a civic sense that's out there, anything on this day that can bring us together, talking to each other as Americans, proud of our history, together, anything that does that is a good thing.
Joe, Clay educated me years ago about Jefferson and holidays and how he was pretty finicky about holidays, including his birthday, but he did approve of the 4th of July. If you were going to give citizens during our time an assignment for the 4th of July, being it reflective or reading, what would you suggest?
I would suggest they just reread the Declaration of Independence, especially the first part. What does it mean now? Especially the most important paragraph in American history, the one that begins, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." To what extent do we still believe that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And then once they start talking, I will ask them how they would define pursuit of happiness for them. And watch the conversation go from there.
About a week or so ago, we did a Jefferson Hour where I talked with President Jefferson as portrayed by Clay Jenkinson. And the subject was the cost of war. And, I think of the 4th of July and I think of the American Revolution, how we owed so much to another nation, France.
Oh, yeah.
Without France's help, we would not have won the war, arguably.
It wouldn't have won it when we did anyway. Yeah, it would have maybe, but you're right. In fact, when Pershing landed in France, head of the American Expeditionary Force in 1917, his aide walked up to the French commander and said, "Tell Lafayette we are here," meaning, you saved us once, we'll save you now.
I can't remember what book you wrote that in, but I remember it. But, in this spirit of freedom and revolution, America now is aiding another country in their attempts to remain free.
Yeah, if you're looking around the world now to see where the values of a free society and of a Jeffersonian republic have the greatest potency, or where they're on display in the most dramatic fashion, it's got to be Ukraine. They're standing for democracy against the attack of an autocratic regime, and that's the issue at stake, and one that we Americans have a vested interest in.
So, David and Joe, I wanted to say a few things about this. One is about Jefferson's optimism. So, the last letter he ever wrote was to Roger Waitman, just a few weeks before his death on the 4th of July, 1826, the same day as Adams died in Quincy, Massachusetts. And in that last letter, which Jefferson clearly wrote as a kind of a testimonial or a legacy letter, he said that all eyes are open or opening to the rights of man. The gradual spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view that the mass of men were not born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God.
You got that phrase from a guy that was killed, a 17th century Englishman who was executed, I think during the English Civil War. But he wanted to go out saying that the values we hold dear will eventually be the values that the whole world embraces.
He said some sooner, some later, eventually all. In other words, that the republic idea, that people govern themselves, that they have rights, that there is a social compact, that we distill our representative will, that there are limits to what any government can do, and that any government that exceeds those systematically must be torn down with violence if necessary. This is Jefferson's fundamental creed, and it is the fundamental creed of freedom-loving people everywhere, including the people of Ukraine. And the question is, when will they get the full measure of self-government? Jefferson said in these letters, oceans of blood are still to be let before the world finally accepts for every nation and every people the idea of the rights of humankind and self-determination. So I think that Jefferson, again, for all of his paradoxes and blindnesses and hypocrisies and inconsistencies, it's Jefferson who honed in on these principles and gave them imperishable expression in the English language. And virtually every revolutionary movement subsequent to 1776 has borrowed from Jefferson, not from any others.
Ho Chi Minh, who wrote the Vietnamese Constitution, began, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." The problem with what you've just said, which is very uplifting, is represented in Adams would say to Jefferson, "Look, I believe in the principles that we've created too, but I'm not sure they'll be able to work in many other countries. We have certain advantages. We have an ocean to separate us from Europe. We have this vast expanse of a continent as a kind of trust fund. I'm not sure this is going to work in, say, France. I'm not sure where they have it," and he's right about that in terms of the French Revolution. I'm not sure it's going to work in Latin America. I would then extend it and say, I'm not sure it's going to work in North Vietnam. I'm not sure it's going to work in Iraq and Iran. I'm not sure it's going to work in Russia. That there's a certain set of conditions that give the American exceptional experience its exceptionalism. It's not going to be translatable in the way that Jefferson, in his universal sense of it, seems to believe.
I say Jefferson would respond to that, Joe, by saying, give it time.
Well, if we give it, okay.
I think that Ukraine is a perfect example of this. Here is a country that has long been part of the sort of the greater world of the Russian Empire and then of the Soviet Union, and it's only been free a couple of times for short periods, but it's leaning west. It's leaning towards the liberal world order. There's a huge setback here, but I think the Ukrainians have already won the psychological battle, and eventually they're going to win the physical battle. And the world is going, and the Russian people are going to see this, and they're going to say, if it can happen there, why can't it happen here? I do believe that we're in for enormous setbacks. Don't get me wrong, and that Jefferson was naive about the exportability of all these things, but I think he was right. And I think George W. Bush was right when he said all peoples on earth want the same things. They want security. They want their children to grow up in a world worth living in. They want to be able to put food on the table. They want to be left alone to the extent that it's possible by government. And they want something like a free market of ideas and a free market of goods and services. And I think that's the Enlightenment. And I think these guys were right, Jefferson, George W. Bush, and others, and that in the long run, we have to keep that faith.
And whether or not those values do come to dominate China, that's the second biggest economy in the world and the largest population. And whether they work in Middle Eastern countries, I think the place that's optimistic on that is India, where I think you can see it. But we are in the midst of an argument now in the world whether autocracy or democracy is the wave of the future.
Autocracy v. democracy. And you know what? The sentence I never thought I would utter in the whole course of my life is, it's happening here too, the debate, autocracy v. democracy.
Right. But you know, both sides of that argument, they both have the same worry, to me anyway, and that is whether or not America survives. Each side is convinced the other will destroy what America is. Maybe what we need to do is take time to redefine what America is, taking into account both sides of that argument.
Boy, that would be a real accomplishment if we could do that. I do think that the problem that the United States faces is that the current government is dysfunctional, and that in some ways the values of the founding it's like an engine that needs to be fully rebuilt. And that to the extent that we are the flagship for democracy, we can't get anything done. We can't function as a democracy. And unless that happens, I can't see us carrying that banner very far. I mean, right now we're living through all these massacres, and 90% of the American people know what the right answers are, and we all know that they're not going to happen. And there's movements afoot in multiple states, not all of them, the former Confederacy, to disenfranchise significant portions of the populace.
All right, now that we've got that realistic pessimism from Mr. Ellis as we close, and Joe, thanks so much for taking some time to talk with us on this 4th of July. But perhaps as we close, you, Clay, could give us a little Jeffersonian optimism, and the both of you could take the opportunity to wish all Americans, and particularly the Thomas Jefferson Hour listeners, a happy 4th.
Absolutely. I want to read something that I think is one of the best things ever written about the 4th of July. Independence Day will be the most memorable epocha in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward, forevermore. That was written by John Adams.
And Adams went to his grave resenting the fact that Jefferson got all the credit for the 4th, but he still thought that the independence itself, whether you define it on the 4th or the 2nd, is the single achievement of American history.
What we did in 1776, to use Jefferson's terms, David and Joe, the little flame that we lit on the 4th of July or the 2nd of July, 1776, has been the flame of the Enlightenment. And the Founding Fathers were right that they were at or near the solution to the human problem. And if we despair of that, we are despairing of the greatest thing that ever happened to humanity, and we would be insane to turn away from it. What we need to do is educate, deepen our commitment, encourage young people to understand the norms and the civic religion in some way that doesn't feel oppressive or clunky. And we need to have a rebirth of our commitment to the idea of a republic, even at this very late stage of that historical process, and to turn away from which would be the greatest mistake that humans ever made, in my opinion. Happy 4th of July, everyone.
I agree with what Clay said and want to do exactly that. And in the process, however, do it aware of what we're up against.
Yeah, see, there was one last jab from John Adams. Just when you think you've got optimism in the air, Joe comes in and says...
It is realistic optimism.
Joe comes in, as usual, says, have you looked around, Mr. Jefferson? Have you looked around? Human nature, Mr. Jefferson.
Well, I'm not being... Because Adams himself is more pessimistic than I am. And we're further down the historical road than we were then. And again, what I see before us are problems and endemic problems in the world and in our country that are not going to be easy to solve. And one of the things we haven't mentioned is climate change. And that's going to change everything. And the extent to which we respond to that collectively as a planet, it will determine whether or not our grandchildren ever celebrate the 4th of July again.
We appreciate you so much, Dr. Joseph Ellis, our special guest on the Jefferson Hour, in this extraordinary 4th of July program. Thanks for listening.
Joe, thanks so much. I appreciate all your perspective, even your pessimism. It's necessary, isn't it, sir?
Without Adams, Jefferson looks like a utopia. But yes, thank you for letting me participate.
We'll talk to you again soon, Joe. Thanks.
Keep me on your Rolodex.
We will, of course. David, a wonderful 4th of July program. I always look forward to this moment every year. Thanks to all of you. Have a safe, patriotic, and joyful 4th of July celebration in this year, 2022. And with that, we'll see you all next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.